There are confessions that sound less like apologies and more like prayers whispered into the dark. Keith Urban's came not as a headline, but as a tremor, quiet, unforced, wrapped in the gravity of a man who has lived long enough to recognize his own reflection in the ruins. He was 57. The kind of age where your voice lowers not from fatigue, but from knowing. In a small Nashville studio, lights dimmed to amber, the hum of the amplifiers breathing like a heartbeat, he sat alone with a guitar that had heard every version of him. For once, there was no producer, no audience, no cameras. Only silence, that rare, expensive silence fame never lets you buy back. He spoke softly, not to explain but to understand. I loved her more than I knew how to, he said, his fingers still tracing a chord that never resolved. And sometimes love doesn't disappear, it just stops trying to prove itself. The words didn't land like confession. They landed like grace. Because in them there was no blame, no scandal, no pity. Only the kind of truth that arrives when a man stops negotiating with his own ghosts. For decades the world had known him as the golden boy of country music. Blue eyes, soft twang, a smile bright enough to sell forgiveness. He was the soundtrack of road trips and heartbreaks, the dreamer who turned longing into melody. And for just as long, he was half of a miracle, the boy from Caboolture and the porcelain star from Hollywood, holding hands across red carpets as if love could be rehearsed. Keith and Nicole. A pairing so luminous it almost made people believe in destiny again. But destiny, he would learn, is rarely peaceful. Fame has a way of turning tenderness into performance. It teaches lovers how to pose before it teaches them how to breathe. Every photograph of them together shimmered with grace and hid the exhaustion beneath. For nearly 20 years they survived the impossible, privacy under a microscope, affection under a headline. It was a triumph that looked like serenity from afar, but up close, it was just two people learning how to keep breathing underwater. He once said, half-jokingly, that applause is the loudest kind of loneliness. And maybe that's what the world had missed. The man behind the spotlight, the one who sang of love while quietly trying to find it again. So when he finally spoke, the world leaned forward, expecting drama, betrayal, something to devour. What it got instead was something rarer, peace. The kind that comes only after every disguise has fallen away. This wasn't the story of a broken marriage. It was the story of a man who had outgrown illusion. The slow transformation of someone who once measured life in chart positions and now measured it in quiet nights where no one expected him to smile. At 57, Keith Urban was not mourning. He was arriving. He no longer needed the fiction of forever. He no longer believed that love must roar to be real. He had learned that the truest kind of devotion isn't about possession, but presence. About staying long enough to see the truth without needing to fix it. The cameras would later call it confession. But those who truly listened understood. It was the sound of a man finally learning how to live without pretending. Before the fame, before the love songs and the headlines, there was a boy sitting cross-legged on the rough carpet of a small Australian house, holding a guitar that was slightly too big for his hands. The air smelled of dust and eucalyptus. Outside, cicadas sang in the heat. Inside, a quiet kind of hunger began to bloom. Keith Lionel Urban was born in Whangarei, New Zealand, on October 26, 1967, but he grew up in Caboolture, a working-class town north of Brisbane, where dreams were small and nights were long. His father, Robert, sold instruments part-time. His mother, Marianne, loved country records and kept them spinning on an old turntable that never quite played in tune. Glenn Campbell, Don Williams, Merle Haggard, their voices drifted through the thin walls like sermons from another world. Keith didn't just hear those songs, he saw them. He saw the open roads, the heartbreak, the redemption stitched into every verse. They told him that even ordinary lives could sound extraordinary if you played them right. At 4, he picked up a ukulele. At 6, a guitar. His father told him, if you want the world to listen, make it feel you. So he practiced until his fingertips bled. When the strings broke, he learned to make the broken ones sing. Every evening their living room turned into a stage. His parents clapped, neighbors listened through the walls. He wasn't chasing applause yet, he was chasing belonging. A place where the music inside him matched the world outside. School was harder. He was shy, quiet, an outsider with an accent and an obsession for American cowboy music. While other kids played rugby, Keith memorized guitar solos. Teachers said he was distracted. Classmates called him strange. But the strings never judged him. They were my first friends, he would later say. Music was the only language I didn't stutter in. By 9, he was entering local talent shows, small town stages with paper banners and folding chairs. He sang songs far older than he was, his voice still soft but disarmingly honest. Judges smiled. His parents beamed. And when he won, he didn't celebrate. He went home, sat by the window, and replayed every mistake in his head. That perfectionism, both gift and curse, had already taken root. When he was 12, his father did something reckless, mortgaged their modest home to buy him a top-quality guitar. Make it count, he said. Keith never forgot. After school he'd watch VHS tapes of Chet Atkins, rewinding the same lick 100 times until his fingers could mimic the grace. While his friends chased girls, he chased tone. The guitar became his sanctuary, a small space of control in a world that often made no sense. At 15 he started playing in bars. Too young to drink, too old to be a dreamer. The air thick with smoke, laughter, and regret. He stood on sticky floors, singing to strangers who clapped more from habit than admiration. But even then, he performed as if the universe itself was listening. You learn who you are on those nights, he once said. You learn whether you're doing this for love or for applause. Those nights shaped him. They taught him endurance, humility, and the art of turning sadness into something beautiful. He learned that silence has rhythm. That longing can be melodic. That even the smallest crowd deserves the whole of your soul. When the final school bell rang and his friends scattered toward predictable lives, Keith packed a suitcase, a guitar, and a map covered in fingerprints. He kissed his mother's cheek, hugged his father tight, and whispered, I'll make it worth it. Then he left Caboolture, chasing not fame, but freedom. He didn't yet know how many times music would save him. But he already believed it could. Nashville, even the word sounded mythical, like a promise written in neon. To a boy from Queensland, it was the promised land, a place where people turned pain into poetry and called it country music. When Keith Urban finally arrived in Nashville in 1992, the dream did not shine. It was rough around the edges, humid, loud, smelling of beer, asphalt, and ambition. He was 24, broke, and carrying more hunger than luggage. Every bar seemed to have 100 versions of himself inside it, hopeful, terrified, half awake with guitars slung like prayers. The city was a proving ground. Every open mic was a battlefield of faith. He rented small rooms with thin walls where the hum of air conditioners blended with the hum of guitars. He played backup for singers who never learned his name, sold instruments to pay rent, slept in borrowed trucks, lived on coffee and stubbornness. But through all of it he carried one truth: as long as the music stayed alive inside him, he would too. He formed a trio called The Ranch, 3 men, 1 dream, and a pile of debts. They toured county fairs, smoky clubs, parking lot festivals, anywhere that offered applause or beer as payment. Crowds were small, sometimes indifferent, but Keith played every note as if it mattered to God himself. He learned that faith was not a feeling, it was endurance disguised as melody. Nights bled together. Load the van. Play the set. Unload at dawn. Write songs in motel rooms that smelled of mildew and hope. He chased sleep like a rumor and drowned exhaustion in whiskey that started as celebration and became anesthesia. The road is lonely, but loneliness has rhythm too, and he played it well. By 1999, the city finally looked back. His self-titled American debut, Keith Urban, hit the radio like a spark in dry grass. The voice was different, not the twang of tradition, not the gloss of pop, but something raw and human, a confession in 4/4 time. But for the grace of God. Where the blacktop ends. Songs that sounded like they were written by someone who had already lost and forgiven himself. Critics called him the new face of country, but what they meant was the new face of honesty. Awards followed, CMA, ACM, shiny proof that the struggle had been real. He smiled for the cameras, but fear whispered behind the flash. Now that he had everything, he finally had something to lose. Success, he discovered, is another kind of cage, this one lined with applause. He chased perfection deeper into the studio, layering sounds until dawn, trying to catch the same wild soul that had gotten him there in the first place. When inspiration ran out, the bottle waited. Whiskey doesn't judge. It only delays. Then, one evening in Los Angeles, 2005, during a charity gala glittering with faces he'd only seen on screens, she appeared. Nicole Kidman, radiant, calm, a contradiction of grace and melancholy. She looked at him, and the noise of the room went mute. He smiled, unsure. She smiled back, sure enough for both of them. She didn't see the fame, he would say later. She saw the man underneath. They talked for 10 minutes that stretched into forever. Two people fluent in the same language of loneliness. Both knew what it meant to be adored by the world and still feel unseen. Something in him shifted that night. For years he had written from pain. Now the songs began to sound like healing. He wrote about hope with trembling hands, about forgiveness in major chords. Love became his new addiction, and for the first time, it didn't destroy him, it steadied him. By June 2006, under the soft Sydney sky, they stood in front of family, friends, and the whole invisible world, promising what every soul secretly hopes for, not perfection, just peace. Candles flickered against stone walls. A violin wept somewhere behind them. When she reached him at the altar, his hands shook, not from fear, but from the miracle of being found. Their kiss felt less like ceremony and more like redemption. The newspapers called it a fairy-tale wedding. He called it a second chance. That year he released Love, Pain, and the Whole Crazy Thing. The title alone told the story. The record sounded like a man walking out of fire with melody instead of scars. Songs of ache and grace, foolish joy and fragile truth. Critics heard a masterpiece, Keith heard survival. But peace is fragile in the world of spotlights. Tour buses replaced lullabies, stadium lights burned hotter than home. Nicole filmed across continents, he played across time zones. They tried to hold hands across oceans, but even love has its limits when the world keeps asking for more. 4 months after their wedding, the headlines struck. Keith Urban enters rehab. The tabloids screamed weakness, reality whispered courage. It wasn't a fall, it was surrender. He had stared too long into the mirror of fame and seen his father's warning in his own eyes. Nicole didn't run. She showed up quietly, without press, without performance. When asked later why she stayed, she said, Because love doesn't run. He came out sober, humbled, changed. She saved my life, he told an interviewer. Not by fixing me, but by believing in me. The next records, Defying Gravity, Get Closer, carried fingerprints of recovery. They weren't albums, they were thank you notes. Proof that resurrection can have rhythm. For a while, it seemed they had outrun the darkness. Red carpets, laughter, shared glances that still looked like beginnings. But love under constant flash is hard work. Cameras don't capture silence, and silence was growing between them. For a while, they looked untouchable. Every photograph, every interview, every red carpet moment felt like a promise that love could survive the noise. The world adored them, the golden couple who had found grace in an industry built on illusion. But even miracles grow tired under constant light. Fame is a mirror that magnifies everything, the beauty, the distance, the cracks you try to hide. Touring became a rhythm that blurred the seasons. Keith spent more nights on buses than in beds. Nicole's scripts took her across continents, London, Paris, New York, while his setlists carried him through Dallas, Chicago, Seattle. They left each other notes, voicemails, half-spoken prayers that began with "I miss you" and ended in static. Their love became choreography, familiar, rehearsed, precise. He once said, "The hardest part of being known is staying real in private." And slowly, that truth began to take shape between them. They were still kind, still tender, still proud of what they built, but somewhere between airports and award shows, silence replaced conversation. It wasn't anger. It was erosion, slow, invisible, inevitable. Friends noticed first. At dinner parties he spoke of their daughters, of songwriting, of sobriety, but rarely of them. Nicole, graceful as ever, would smile and say, "Oh, we're both very busy." And everyone at the table would nod, pretending that phrase didn't mean what it always meant in Hollywood. By the early 2020s, the world began to whisper. Were they drifting apart? Had fame finally caught up? The tabloids wrote their fantasies of betrayal, but the truth was quieter and sadder. Two good people trying to hold something sacred while the world watched through glass. Keith refused bitterness. "Marriage," he said once, "isn't a promise that you'll never change. It's a hope that you'll keep changing together." But change doesn't always follow the same rhythm. And for two artists whose lives were built on rhythm, that realization hurt the most. He began writing again, not hits, not stadium anthems, but confessions. Small songs recorded in dim rooms, stripped of polish and pride. We were, parallel line, everybody hurts. They weren't commercial, they were cathartic. It was the sound of a man turning the lights back down to human. Nicole, meanwhile, poured her emotions into roles that mirrored her own evolution. Big Little Lies, The Undoing, Expats, characters made of beauty and fracture. On screen, she cried the tears that reality required her to hide. Their art became the bridge between them, distant, parallel, but still connected. By 2023, the silence was impossible to disguise. There were fewer public appearances, fewer photographs, fewer joint interviews. Not because they had fallen out of love, but because they had learned to stop performing it. When a journalist asked Nicole if they were still together, she smiled softly and said, "He will always be my family. That's all I'll ever say." It was the kind of answer that both ends and honors a story. Keith never contradicted her. He spoke of gratitude, not grief. "She believed in me when I couldn't," he told an audience one night. That kind of love doesn't disappear. It just changes its color. For him, that color was peace. He began to write about forgiveness, not of others, but of himself. He had spent decades performing survival. Now he was learning how to live. He spoke of emotional sobriety, the art of staying clear even when you're sober, the quiet discipline of facing life without armor. The hardest addiction to break, he said, is the addiction to control. At 57, Keith Urban was done chasing perfection. He didn't want to be adored. He wanted to be understood. He no longer believed in forever as a contract. He believed in it as a presence, the way music lingers even after the last chord fades. He still saw Nicole, still shared laughter at family milestones. There was no bitterness, no spectacle, just the soft echo of two souls who had outgrown the same dream. To the public, it looked like an ending. To him, it was simply an evolution. I used to think love meant holding on, he said during a quiet concert in 2024. Now I think it means knowing when to let go, and still wishing them peace. The crowd didn't cheer. They stood in silence, as if witnessing something sacred. A confession, not a show. He strummed the guitar once more, let the chord hang in the air, and smiled. That night, and in every night that followed, the applause felt softer, not because it was smaller, but because he no longer needed it to survive. The stage had been his sanctuary for decades, a chapel built from chords and confessions. It had saved him, broken him, rebuilt him. But now, as the lights rose for what he quietly called his last full tour, Keith Urban stood differently. No armor. No mask. Just a man and his guitar, older but lighter, the years finally resting instead of pressing. He played the familiar hits, the anthems that once made crowds roar, but they sounded different now. Slower, simpler, almost like lullabies. He smiled more between songs, not for the cameras, but for the people who had grown up with him, who had aged with his voice in their cars. Between numbers he spoke gently, like a friend winding down a long conversation. I used to think happiness was applause, he said one night. Now I think it's being able to go home, sit with yourself, and not need anyone to tell you who you are. No one cheered at first. Then, slowly, the crowd rose, not in frenzy, but in reverence. They weren't clapping for fame anymore. They were clapping for peace. He began ending each show with a song that wasn't on any album. It had no official title on the setlist, just a note, still here. The melody was fragile, almost unfinished, like something whispered instead of sung. I've broken in half just to learn how to bend, he sang. I've lost what I loved just to love it again. And if the world forgets my name or my song, I'll still be here, where I've belonged all along. The crowds fell silent. No phones, no flashing lights, just breath, shared between strangers. When the final chord faded, Keith didn't bow. He simply stood there, eyes wet, the guitar hanging loose by his side. Then he whispered, "A thank you for listening to my life." He walked off stage without drama, handed his guitar to a crew member, and disappeared behind the curtain. Outside, the Nashville night waited, humid, familiar, humming with the same quiet energy it had carried when he first arrived, young and terrified. He looked up. The sky was wide and kind. He smiled, not like a star, but like a man who had survived his own story. Months later, in a small porch interview lit only by candles, a journalist asked him the question that had hovered over his whole life. After everything, the fame, the love, the loss, what do you think it all meant? Keith paused, watching fireflies drift through the Tennessee dark. Then he said, "It's all just music, isn't it? The mistakes, the miracles, they're part of the same song. You just have to keep playing." He leaned back, a small smile tracing his face. And if you're lucky, he added softly, as someone you once loved will still be humming it too. The camera lingered. His features, lined with laughter and pain alike, seemed to glow, not from youth, but from gentleness. Behind him, the wind moved through the trees, carrying a faint echo of a melody that sounded eternal. And for a moment, just before the screen faded to black, you could almost hear his voice, quiet and infinite, whispering the final line of his life's chorus. Every song I ever wrote was just my way of saying I'm still here. That was the truth he'd been circling all along. Not scandal, not sorrow, but serenity. Not the end of love, but its transformation. The boy who once dreamed of Nashville had found something bigger than fame or forgiveness. He had found stillness. And in that stillness, Keith Urban remains, not as an idol, not as a myth, but as a man who turned his wounds into melody, his silence into peace, and his love into something that will never stop singing.